Hey, a big warm welcome to day 2 of the Results UK National Conference, and welcome to those who are new joining us today, and welcome back to those who joined us yesterday. This year's theme of the conference is Take a Stance and Find Chances for Change. We know that this year and the last sort of 2 years have been quite tricky for our campaigning, and many things have changed, but that it's still important that we speak up and that there are opportunities to change how we campaign and what we campaign on. I'm Ruthie Walters, Campaigns Coordinator at Results UK, and we're an advocacy organisation with a vision to end global poverty. You can check out the Results UK website for more information about what we do and also how to get involved. But for now, this panel discussion in this session is really exciting. So the session's called Taking a Stance on the Language We Use. We'll be hearing from a panel of amazing speakers and have a chance to reflect on what we do. We're holding this panel discussion about why the way we talk about poverty and injustice matters, because at Results UK, we're committed and motivated to do better when it comes to addressing oppression and privilege in all its forms. One aspect of our anti-oppression work is looking at the language we use, and I hope you'll join us on that journey. From the letters you write as campaigners to what we share on social media and how we talk to others about issues we advocate for, we all have a role to play in doing more and doing better. Before I hand over to Motunrayo, who will be chairing this session, I just have some housekeeping notices. Please keep yourself on mute unless you're invited to speak, asking a question or in the breakout groups. And we will be going into breakout groups later for a short chat amongst yourselves. It would be really nice if you're able to and comfortable to keep your camera on, especially in the breakout, so that it feels a bit more personable. And you can turn on closed captions on the bottom of the screen so that you can see subtitles by clicking the live transcript icon. And just so you know, we'll be recording the discussion part of this session. Final thing, if you have any tech issues at all or questions, you can put them in the chat box, and we'll also be using the chat box for some discussion throughout the session, as well as the forum. The forum is on our national conference website, and we encourage you to make the most of it. But in this session, we encourage you specifically to use it so that you have a record of what's been talked about. And there'll be a specific link for the forum put in the chat, so it should be quite straightforward, but just reach out and ask us if you have any questions. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Motunrayo and our chair, who will be chairing this panel discussion, and to our panellists.
Thank you, Ruthie. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion today. I think I'd like to just remind everyone that this is a 45-minute discussion. So this is really the beginning of the journey. And while you listen to what our great speakers have to say, I ask that you think about the ways you can challenge yourselves, hold yourselves accountable and each other. I think, this work doesn't change overnight, and it's about collective action. We can't achieve this individually. So while you're thinking about that, please put your questions in the Zoom chat and in the forum, like Ruthie mentioned. I'm hoping that we'll have enough time for Q&A with our panelists later, so I can put that to them. And again, if there are any words or phrases or concepts that you're unsure about that you would love the panelists to speak to, again, do drop that in the Zoom chat or forum. I think that was my preamble done. So let's move over to introductions with the panelists. And I'd love to start with Mitzi. We'll then hear from Abraham, and we'll end introductions with Sarika.
Hey everyone, so I'm Mitzi Jonelle. I am a climate justice activist based in Metro Manila, Philippines, and I organize with Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, which is a mouthful. But basically we are the Fridays for Future of our country, and I also organize with Fridays for Future MAPA, which is Most Affected Peoples and Areas, and with International. So a lot of my work is around climate justice, but my approach to climate justice isn't from necessarily that environmental science side, but more of the human justice aspect of it, the human rights aspect of it, especially coming from a country that is so impacted by the climate crisis and something that I basically grew up with. It's so important to me that the way we approach the climate crisis isn't as just an environmental thing, or as a lot of media and society makes us think that it is a white movement, but it's not. It's our movement. It's a movement of the people of color, but it's been taken away from us. It's something that's super important that we remember that. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Mitzi. Abraham?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Abraham Makanjuola. I'm originally from Nigeria and Sierra Leone, but I was born and raised in London. I am currently working as a research officer in health economics, and I'm specifically interested in well-being and wellness in my academic and professional field. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarika Bansal. I am based in Nairobi, Kenya. I used to run a magazine called Bright Magazine, which focused on telling solutions-oriented stories about health, education, and gender. And since it's closed now, and I just came out with a book called Tread Brightly, Notes on Ethical Travel, which is all about looking at what are the cultural, environmental, and social elements of traveling the world, and how can you think about just showing up to a place with humility and you know, just like an eye to curiosity.
Thank you. I'm really excited about the range of perspectives. I think both geographically, but I think also, you know, kind of background wise. I guess who wants to kick us off and say why does the way we talk about poverty and injustice matter? I'm gonna open the floor. Does anyone want to give it a shot? Abraham, please go ahead.
It's important because if we assume that everybody wants to have a more equality within society, then we have to be accurate and precise kind of with our intentions. So it's very important to kind of visit what we say and how we say it and why. So that's my kind of thoughts in a nutshell.
I also think that to just add on to what Abraham was saying, that that when you think about like how we talk about poverty and injustice, it also says who's included in that. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of times that a lot of people in the development world use a lot of jargon and a lot of really big words. And then if you go to a meeting, you know, that's actually in the place where your development is supposed to happen and people don't understand that, then that means that they're not actually invited into the process. So, so in addition to, you know, creating that in-group, out-group feel, you just end up purposefully excluding the people who you're trying to include and who you're trying to benefit in the first place.
And to add to that, it's also how language is so important because it can really shape and build people's perspectives and our own perspectives. Like the way we say things often reflects what we think. And whatever we say, whatever we put out into the world, it adds to this narrative. So the question now is, are the words we're using, are the things we're saying, are they adding to this narrative, this system that is rotting and leaving people behind, or is this changing that system actively? Of course, changing our words will never be enough. It's not just that, but it's a first step, and it's something that reflects the way we're thinking. It's really more of, I would say, a symptom of us trying to change ourselves to get rid of that inner capitalist inside our brains that we have to get rid of in order to remove injustice and poverty.
Yeah, a lot of the language in the development world, I think it really focuses on the person who's doing it. So if you think of the do-gooder or the person, you know, it's like, oh, I'm going in the field. It really reflects this like who's in and who's out, and who is the person who's doing and who is being done to. And it kind of creates that dichotomy very strongly of who's the one who is, and the person who is doing, often the language really reflects their intentions, not necessarily their outcomes. So you're thinking about, oh, well, this person has really good intentions, and that's what's important. And then that ends up being codified through the language that we use. versus the person who is part of the community, who you are doing things to, is the beneficiary, who just as a result, like, just sort of feels flat and should just be thankful for what they're receiving and not an active part of creating their future.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to try and keep up because I'm actually taking notes like a student, even though I'm actually chairing this discussion. But actually, I'd like to continue on that, like around that theme, and just for the attendees to know, like, we've either already had discussions around, phrases and concepts that we could change. And so Sarika, I'd actually like to come to you because I know one of the things that you'd spoken about was the importance of specificity. I can never say that word. And naming countries instead of using, like, generic terms like the developing world. And so could you speak to why that is, what your alternatives are, and why?
Yeah. First of all, I love the fact that you asked us before the session started to think about words to use, because it's so easy to just malign language and just say that these are problematic, you shouldn't do this. But that's actually not, I mean, it's somewhat helpful, but in the end, it's so much more helpful to think about what you can replace it with. So for me, I always try to, whenever possible, to just say the name of a place. There's a lot of a tendency within the development world to use phrases like the developing world, or I'm going in the field is also very popular, or I'm going in the bush, I'm going, and it's just like, and it feels very vague that way. And the other problem with phrases like developing world is that the developing world is extraordinarily diverse. If you take a place like India, and a place like Bolivia, and a place like North Korea, let's say, those are all extraordinarily different countries with very different political systems and histories and cultures, and you're just lumping them all into this category of developing world. And it just doesn't really give justice to how diverse the world really is. And then on the flip side, if you think about places that are in the industrialized world, like the United States, then it doesn't also tell you all of the diversity within the United States. There's places like Flint, Michigan that still don't have clean water, and there's places that have really crumbling infrastructure, as we've seen in the last week with all of these climate related crises. And it doesn't really tell you how much there is still to develop in those places. So yeah, and I think that also, like, phrases like in the field, or I'm on the ground, is another one that's very popular. Those again, kind of speaking back to my previous point, also, I think they really also show a difference between the where the power center lies. And the power center is never in the field, the power center is never on the ground. That's just where the color is. That's where, I mean, like, people of color often are, where if you're a journalist and you're looking and you're doing a story, it's often where you find the person at the beginning of your story to be like, oh, Angela was a mother of 3 who led a very difficult life, and here she was walking in her beautiful color printed skirt. And then you move on to the meat of the story, and then you get to the experts who are in places like London and New York. So it just really doesn't give those places that are on the ground, in the field, the type of dignity that you would give to a university professor. And yeah, so I think that whenever I would just challenge everyone that whenever you're about to say one of those phrases, that if you can just say the name of the place instead, that it actually just gives everyone that much more humanity and that much more dignity.
Thank you. And actually, perfect segue on the topic of humanity and dignity to people. I'd actually like Abraham to speak to this point around speaking, I guess, making it a bit more personal and speaking with people, listening to people and not speaking for them. As Sarika gave that great example of, journalists, or, even me that works in the development sector. And I think is quite mindful to this, also thinking about ways that I can perpetuate some of this bad behavior. So yeah, if you could talk about the importance of, I guess, taking a very human and people-centric approach.
Okay, so what I'd like to say first is, if everyone can kind of go on a journey with me, if you cast your mind back to when you were in school, for those of us that were in the West, at least, or let me specifically speak about the UK, when we would have parents' evenings and things like that, you know, you kind of have your tail between your legs, in the sense that you might have not necessarily performed really well, or you might have, some of the comments might be that, oh, such and such a person talks too much, but they're really bright, and all these kinds of things. The reason why I say that is because when your teachers and your parents are then kind of trying to devise a solution for whatever issue may have arisen, it's often that you're right there in the mix of the conversation, you're being spoken about, but no one's asking you what you think or what the problem is. And the reason I wanted to kind of draw on that kind of personal experience is because I'm sure some of us can relate to that. It's kind of strange, because it's like you're talking about me, but you're not necessarily asking me what I need. And although it's easy for people to feel that they have our best interests at heart, until you listen to people and hear what they have to say, you have to assume that you're ignorant. So with in the case of poverty and injustice, my experiences are very, very different to other people. And again, I will see something from one side, but a whole different group of people will see things from another side. And it's very easy if, as Sarika said, that excuse me, it's very easy to, you know, it's very easy for us to basically make these decisions, and the people with the power, quote unquote, or being able to control these kind of decisions are far away. It might be, you know, geographically, it might be in terms of privilege or position, and it's very easy for them to then detach themselves from the situation. You know, you go and do your work in the field, then you come home, you switch off and you go and watch Netflix, and then that's it. Whereas there are people that are living this day in, day out, and what we see and what they see and what they live and experience are completely different things. So what I'd really challenge people to do is make sure that we listen, because we can't assume that we're experts in somebody else's struggle or situation. So those are things that I wanted to share, basically.
Thank you, Abraham. I know there's some conversation happening in the chat, so that's great. And again, I just want to remind people, if you do have questions that you'd like to put to the panelists, or if you have any phrases you'd like us to discuss, please do share in the Zoom chat or the forum. I would like to come on to Q&A shortly if we do have questions. But on the topic of experts, I love all this like really easy segueing for me. I'm moving over to Mitzi, who I think it's fair to say is an expert in her field and around climate, Mitzi, around climate change and climate justice. And I guess we're taking the conversation out again, but I'm really intrigued in this, you're thinking about how we can better frame tackling the climate crisis, particularly around how we should frame the money that we give to tackling the climate crisis. I just want to preface by saying the concepts that you're about to talk about might be quite new to a lot of the attendees. So if you could give a bit of context as well, and why you're offering this specific alternative, that would be great.
So with the climate crisis, something that, as I was saying earlier, it's often seen as an environmental issue and devoid from the human side of it, which is so important, because if you forget that part, you forget the people who are most marginalized and who are most impacted by the climate crisis. And one very crucial thing to remember is that historically, the people and the countries that are most responsible for the climate crisis are the global north countries. So especially the US, right now it's China, but a big chunk of Europe also. So it's really the global north countries which are historically responsible for the climate crisis. And the countries that are being hit the hardest by the climate crisis are countries like the Philippines, which only contribute less than 0.37% of carbon dioxide emissions to so the countries that are most impacted are the countries that are least responsible. So now there's this concept of climate finance where, for example, in the latest G7 meeting, Boris Johnson said, oh, we have to give solidarity and aid to the countries in the global south who are still developing because they're being hit the hardest by the climate crisis. This is our duty to them as fellow mankind. We have to help them. But that is a very white savioristy concept, because then you take away the accountability of these countries. The reason why climate finance and financial aid shouldn't be seen as solidarity money is because this money is owed to the countries in the global south, because we're not supposed to be experiencing these impacts. This is happening because of the global north countries. So that climate finance, that financial aid, that help isn't help, it's a debt to humanity in the global south especially. So it's so important to frame it that way. And it's not that climate finance is just one specific example, but really in so many things, we have to stop seeing another example of that kind of same idea or thought is framing other aspects of financial aid as help or solidarity, when often that problem that happens in that country that needs financial support for is caused by the global north countries. The reason why these countries are in debt in the first place is because of the global north countries, because of the colonialism that has happened. So it's so important that we stop seeing the global north as these people who are in power here to help, but rather they're in power because of unfair things that have happened in the past, because of injustice. And so any help, quote unquote, that they're doing now isn't help. It's them repaying for everything that they've done in the past.
Thank you, Mitzi. And it's really interesting because I'm sort of aware of this conversation, but I think the way you framed it was really, has given me a lot of food for thought. We have some questions actually, so I would like to move on to those, and then maybe we can go back to some of the other concepts and phrases that you panelists have shared. There's a question from Jill in the forum. Jill says, I come from a world of disability. One of our phrases is nothing about us without us. Is there anything in development language that reflects this? I might pass over to Sarika first to see if you have a great.
Well, I think that I mean, I love that phrase, nothing about us without us. I feel like that fits into the broader idea of people first language. So not defining a person by a temporary state, but really defining them first and foremost by their humanity. So for example, not calling someone a convict or prisoner because that's a temporary state, but someone who is in prison, and really just again, you're centering that humanity first, and then later you're talking about their status that's relevant to the conversation. You can say the same with immigrant or refugee. Again, you can instead of just defining them by that by their immigration status or the refugee status, you first define them as a human being. So I think that there's a lot there that I think you can apply to many different sectors, in addition to the disability sector. And it's sometimes a bit clunky, and I will say this as a writer and an editor, like it's definitely sometimes really clunky to try to edit in that kind of way. But when you're able to do it, it's fantastic. Like, there's a way to do it sometimes where the first time you talk about someone, you just say it fully, and then afterwards you just use their last name, as opposed to just saying like, oh, illegal aliens are such and such. It just kind of forces you to move away from generalizations and talk about one person's specific case, which is, as a writer, is always a better thing to do rather than speak in generalities.
Yes, Jill said that we say a person with epilepsy rather than an epileptic. So yeah,
so that you're not defining them by that one feature, which can lead to more dehumanization later down the road.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Corinne, apologies. I find talking about the development sector difficult, as what it is normally focused on is people's lives. Is that a sector? Maybe Abraham can take this one with the focus on people. Sorry to pick on people. Mitzi, you're coming next.
I think that's a really good question. I wouldn't say I necessarily have a specific or direct answer to that question, but I would say when focusing on people, it's really difficult to then not get into kind of looking at percentages and you know, outcomes as opposed to what the actual impact is, because I think they're two very separate things. I think for ease of having you know, and let's say an industry or a sector, it's easy to call it that, but I think if we can kind of remove the sector kind of the secondary part to it, or just remove the idea of the term sector and just focus on the people and the impact as opposed to the outcomes and the numbers, then I think you know, it will yield let's say greater results, for lack of a better term. I hope that's answered your question without being too abstract or existential in a way.
Can I add one small thing to that, which is I've often said this is in regards to using jargon in development, is that, you know, with so much of what we call the development sector, it's really talking about the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're talking about, you know, giving people shelter, giving people food, giving people water, like the really basics of what's needed for life. And yet at the same time, like, we're talking about things that are so fundamental to being human, and we dress it up with so much language, so many conferences, so many different things that make it so fancy, that take it away so far away from what actually is at the root of what it is. And I think that just, you know, keeping that in mind, that this is the very basic, these are very basic human needs at the bottom of the Maslow's hierarchy. I think that just helps me center that, okay, what am I really doing this for? Like, what is the actual purpose of this?
I agree. I think that's one thing in the sector that we can get very bogged down in almost our day-to-day. And when I say delivery, I just mean like the work that we have to do. But I think having ways to remind yourself of why we do what we do. I think often it's very easy to talk in political language, and we've kind of we can forget that we're talking about real people, you know, like people like me and you who have friends, who have family, who are just wanting to, you know, live a sort of holistic, healthy life in the places that they are. So remembering that. We probably have about 5-ish minutes left before we go into breakout rooms. So I just say that for attendees who want to get their last couple of questions in, please do. Mitzi, I would like to come back to you. Oh, let me see. Oh, yes. Okay, great. So Mitzi, we have a question that I think would be great to answer. This is from Corinne again, and they asked, the feedback about the last earthquake in Haiti and the lack of real progress in spite of lots of aid activity is really discouraging. Are there lessons we can learn from it? And I just frame this to you because I'm thinking about the sort of, I guess, the climate sort of geographical impact of that question.
So I'm not entirely sure what has happened in the latest earthquake in Haiti and the aid there, but I know historically in Haiti and in a lot of countries, especially with natural disasters, so much of the aid that comes in, this one will be from my experience in the Philippines, is that where does the aid actually go? Is it to actually develop the country in a people-centered, people-focused way where, let's say, there are proper evacuation centers, there's proper research into what's happening and building proper infrastructure, or is it always just relief, just food, and which is so important, don't get me wrong, like the helping people who are impacted is so important, but that shouldn't be where it stops. That's always where it stops. It's always like, oh, look at these poor people who've lost their homes, who've lost their clothes, who've lost their, who need food, who need help. And that's what you throw aid to help these poor, undeveloped people, quote unquote. And that's one of the main problems, I would say, with aid activity. And that's one of the lessons that we need to really focus on, the way that we frame aid as something that is to help the poorer person, when really it's supposed to be, how do we develop society, which they are part of and which we are part of, so that no one is left behind. It's so important that we also look at some of the aid that comes into a lot of countries, either as come in as loans, so you end up in debt as your country, or there are neoliberal policies that come along with it. So you suddenly have tax subsidies. And so later on, your local farmers or your local businessmen and women suffer. So it's really part of this bigger narrative of aid and helping, when really it's supposed to be a community and society that's coming together to make sure that no one is left behind. And that means forgoing this idea of profit and forgoing this idea of a lot of it stems in colonialism and this white saviorism, and it really is getting rid of that. And remembering that there's this really beautiful quote, which I'm gonna butcher because I don't remember it, but if you have come here to help me, then I don't need you, or something like that. But if you have come here to work with me towards our common liberation, then let's get going.
Thank you, Mitzi. I'm going to be really ambitious and try and squeeze in these last few questions and comments. So first one, from Davina or Davina, apologies again if I haven't not pronounced that correctly. Part of the solution to global issues is leveraging cutting-edge technology. With the focus of today's discussion on language, changing the narrative and breaking down stereotypes, what role do you think technology can play in this regard? I'm just going to open it up for anyone who unmutes first.
I'll talk for a second, and then I'm sure either Abraham or Mitzi have something to add, which is that I think with a lot of technology, it's important with who you develop it with. I think about human-centered design, and you're thinking about, really thinking who's the end user for this product, and is it really actually fitting? Is it creating a solution to something that's in their everyday world? Is it something that they would actually value? And really developing it with them, understanding like, well, what buttons would actually be useful for you? And then the other thing is with technology is that once it's developed, that's not the end. Giving people support, giving people the means to be trained on how to use it in a way that isn't condescending, but really just is supportive, and giving people a way to just be in touch afterwards in case it's not working the way they wanted it to. I think a lot of tech companies that I see in Kenya, which is known as the Silicon Savannah, it often kind of fail at that last step, that they just develop the thing and then they're hands off and they're like, well, okay, if you have a problem with it, then whatever. That's just going to create more e-waste in the universe. And what's the purpose of that? And especially if it was something that wasn't even developed with the people who are actually using it in mind, then why did you do it in the first place? You may as well just, stay at home in Silicon Valley and do something else.
Thanks, Sarika. Peter, this is just a comment. He said he'd like to say, while Abraham is talking about listening to those in need, he feels that it's more important to listen to those we address within our own community. So from neighbours to our Prime Minister. His advocacy is to create the commitment to end hunger from here, which he agrees is the source of many of the problems in developing countries, or countries like Bolivia, Nigeria, and so on and so forth, being specific. I know we're about to go into breakout rooms shortly. Before that, I don't know, I hope it's okay with results stuff. If each of the panelists would like to give maybe like a closing word. Abraham, would we, again, sorry, just putting you on the spot. I don't know if there's anything, just any reflections that you'd like to share with attendees before they go into breakout group.
Just a kind of general sign out, I guess, would be, as you said in the beginning, it is definitely an introduction, this session. So definitely embrace kind of the discomfort and challenging your schools of thought, because once you go past that discomfort, then that's where real progress will be able to take place. But don't shy away from it. Have these conversations with people and ask questions, really, because everyone has a different perspective. Everyone has a way that they will be able to help you, or at least maybe point you in the direction of someone that can help. So that's how I'd like to sign up. Thank you for listening as well.
Thank you. Sarika?
Yeah, I would just love to say how impressed I am with everyone here, my fellow panelists. You raised such fantastic points. I really like Mitzi's challenge, especially to think about colonialism and history, that, you know, the world doesn't look like how it does by accident, and that there's so much, unfortunately, there's a lot of intentionality behind the way the world is shaped today, and who has power and who doesn't. And I think that bringing that into our language and our everyday use, and just into our everyday work, is just an ongoing thing that all of us can do. So thank you all so much for being here and being so active in this discussion.
And finally, Mitzi.
Yeah, it has been such a great discussion. I love talking about how language is something that we should be so intentional about and actively trying to change, because again, it's only one part of what we need to change. As Sarika mentioned, also with the technology question, they're actually really connected, because when changing the narrative and breaking down stereotypes, that's only one of the things we do in science and technology. Our lives, the way we talk to people, everything in society is connected to that. And when we are trying to change this narrative, then that's also what we're trying to make sure, that technology becomes people-centered, that development becomes people-centered, that how we view economy becomes people-centered instead of profit-centered. So it's all of these things. And this is just one of the things to start getting there, and we have to really be intentional about it. It's, as Abraham mentioned, so difficult and will be very uncomfortable, but the sooner that we get used to that discomfort, the sooner that we realize that we will always forever be learning, is the time that we also start to really enjoy that. Like, I love getting criticized almost, because it means that I can improve, and when I improve, that means it's also making the movement and the place that we're creating a better place. So it's really about creating worlds together.
Thank you, Mitzi. And again, another perfect segue into what I was saying about the fact that this is a collective, this takes collective action, and it's a collective process. And I think we need to remember that when centering people, we're creating community. Result staff, please forgive me. I appreciate I ran slightly over time. So attendees, you're about to go into breakout groups. I think you'll have about 10-ish minutes. Again, really sorry that I cut into your time, where you will reflect on the panel, what you've heard from the panelists, anything that stood out to you, and then also what you think you'll be doing going forward and the actions that you can take.